We're off mute. Okay. Good morning. We don't have a chair this morning. Jason is not feeling well, so he's not at the meeting today. So I think our first item of business would be to appoint a temporary chair.
I would nominate Chris Farrar to be our temporary chair for this meeting, since he's already been in that role.
So,
Right.
I don't know if it needs a second, but just for the sake of argument, can we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. I think that was Jeremy.
Oh, who else is online here?
We have Jeremy, Linder, and Mike.
Okay.
All right. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, Chris, I turn it over to you.
All right. Guess we'll start with the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And if we could proceed to the roll call.
We have Commissioner Powers absent, Commissioner Krushauer is absent, and then Commissioner Magyar.
Here.
Commissioner Stetanovich. Absent. Commissioner Johnson.
I'm here.
Commissioner Linder.
Here.
And Commissioner Farrar.
Present.
And just to clarify the record, since you didn't know this, Commissioner Powers has resigned, so he's gone.
I'd ask that we consider adopting the agenda. Motion on that?
I'll move we adopt the agenda.
Been moved to adopt the agenda. And I think somebody seconded that. So all those in favor, please signify by aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, agenda is adopted as presented. And at this point in the meeting, we are open for public comment. There's an opportunity for anyone to give a brief presentation about any land use planning issue or county concern that is a concern. I don't see that it necessarily needs not to be on the agenda, but I don't see anybody in the room. Do we have anybody online, or has anybody submitted any written comments? Doesn't appear so. So there's no public comment at this meeting. By the way, I'm not sure I announced that this is the May 14th, 2024 regular meeting of the Clatsop County Planning Commission. I'm sure that was pointed out earlier. Next is our first real item of business today, although it's not, okay. Clear and objective standards, a continuation of some of the work we've been doing the last few meetings. So if we could begin with a staff report on today's installment.
Yes, thank you. All right, so for the record, I'm Gail Henriksen, Community Development Director. And today we're going to be going over several different sections of Article 3 that are related primarily to vehicle access, transportation improvements, bicycle and pedestrian access, and subdivision requirements. A lot of these sections of code were updated in 2021 when we updated our subdivision regulations. So as we work through this, you'll see that there are minimal changes. A lot of how subdivisions are recorded and the platting requirements and the information needed are prescribed by ORS 92. So we don't have a lot of latitude to sort of adjust our process and do things differently than what state statute requires. So you'll see that there are minimum changes there. However, as we start with section 3.9, 9510, which is on page 6 of your Planning Commission agenda. We've done some rewriting on this. A lot of this language was very unclear. Some of it is not, the information included really wasn't related to the purpose of access control, so we rewrote that beginning section almost entirely to make it easier to understand and make it succinct so that it was really focused on what this section was trying to accomplish. Moving down to section 3.9520 on page 7, you'll see that this section, which talks about different types of access management standards, we've added some definitions in there and have changed some of the existing definitions so they're consistent with what's in Article 1 of the code. Moving on to section 3.9530, this is the clear vision area section, and this talks about areas at an intersection, whether it's two roads coming together or a street and a railroad. You have requirements that should be maintained so that people pulling up to that intersection are able to see what's coming at them from either direction. And so this section has always been problematic for the planning staff. It's not very clearly worded, and so we've done a lot of rewriting on this. We haven't changed the requirements, but we've tried to lay it out in a way that makes it easier to read, easier to understand, and easier to interpret, or actually to eliminate the need for interpretation, which is what this whole project is about. And so one thing that we did add that has always been included is that at the very beginning of section 3.9530, which starts on page 8 of your packet, it says a clear vision area shall be maintained on the corners of all property at the intersection of two streets or a street and a railroad. But we never actually had a standard for the street and the railroad intersection, so we did create that and put that into the code because it's always been discussed, but we never had a number associated with it. We've tried to really explain how you measure a clear vision area, how that triangle is formed, and try to put that into everyday language that people can understand. And then we added a table, which is on page 10 of your packet, that makes it easy to pick out what your clear vision area is going to be, depending on the type of zone that you're in and what you're intersecting with. All right. So we'll pause there to see if there's any questions about those first 3 sections or any comments.
Do any of the commissioners, go ahead.
I have a question on that clear vision. Clearly necessary, and I mean, for obvious reasons. It's hard to move around sometimes because of cars parked up against the intersections. How do you see this playing out in a subdivision? Are you going to say that each recorded subdivision needs to show these clear vision triangles, and they are sort of specially designated areas that restrict parking, signs, trees, anything of that nature? Is that how you plan to do this?
The requirement's already in the code, Commissioner Magyar. So so it would be applied to a subdivision now. For example, Dune Estates would have had these same requirements if they had an intersection of two streets. So we've just tried to make it clearer. We don't request that it be shown on a plat or anything, but it is something that we would review so that if there were something, I don't know, maybe like a monument or what's the word I'm looking for? An entry feature, say along the highway and the intersecting street, we would want to make sure that it did not interfere with the clear vision area.
Right, got it. In literally all of my subdivisions, I don't recall there being anything shown on my plats like that, but it would make sense that that was the way it was. And I guess I just was blissfully unaware that they were being enforced in any kind of way. So you're not going to require those triangles to be shown then on future
We never
plats?
have.
Okay,
No, we never have. I mean, we certainly could ask for it, but we never really have done that.
thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners on these sections? I had just a quick question. On page 10 there, in the table labeled 3.x, the last item in there is railroad, and minimum clear area is 25 feet. And then below that it says exception, if angle of intersection is less than 30 degrees, the minimum clear area is 25 feet. So I mean, is that an exception? It's the same number, or is that intentional?
That's a good question. It is in the existing code. So if you go back to page 9, at the bottom of page 9 in the existing language column, you'll see that that exception is already in there, but that's a good point, and I'm not sure why or why it's repetitive, so I will take a closer look at that one.
Another question is, the idea of a clear area is as Commissioner Magyar stated, is very obvious and important. It seems like the clear area would be necessarily larger if say a street is entering a highway, where you want to have that longer view, because the speed of vehicles on the highway is longer, so you don't want to pull out in front of somebody on a highway with only 50 feet of clearance, where that might be enough in a neighborhood where the speed limit's 25. So is that accounted for here, and I'm just missing some of the...
So ODOT, which controls the highways, will have their own development standards. So ours are intended more for county roads and for local streets.
So on those roads, the speed limit, it tends to be, what's the maximum speed limit on?
Probably 55.
On a county road?
So if you think of Lewis and Clark or Logan or one of those roads.
So on those, it seems like you do need a longer viewpoint to ensure that you're not cutting somebody off than you would in a slow-moving situation. I realize you're just revising wording here and not taking up actual... We can ask Public Works to review it to see if they feel they have enough clearance under the existing standards. We've never heard anything from them that said they felt it was not a safe situation, and that's the minimum area. And we did go through this section again in 2021 with Public Works. So, but we can verify that nothing has changed over the past 3 years. Okay. The only other thing I'll say is figures and pictures are worth 1,000 words, and even though you tried to state what that triangle looks like at the corner, and you mentioned there is a figure to go with that, but it's not included in the packet. I think figures are a great idea for a lot of these things.
Yeah.
It's much easier to grasp.
Yeah, we do have 2 figures that are already in the code, and we would just continue to use those.
Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, just one final statement regarding subdivisions, recorded subdivision plats, and this triangle. I'd just like to say that in other states where I've worked, this is it's pretty common practice to show that, because it becomes a restriction that then encumbers the adjoining lot, right? And so people can't put in a cypress tree right on the corner, and other things like that. So I mean, in some ways, I find that showing that triangle might actually sort of help the homeowner to show, well, what the restrictions are, in the same way that you would show an 8-foot public utility easement or any kind of other kind of easement of that nature. So it's just, and it also helps. I just think it helps to show it, and then I don't think it hurts. It's a little bit of an extra detail, yes, but you know, you could make a note even that says there's a restriction, even if you don't want to show the triangle. And that's just my comment.
Thank you for that comment. Any others? If not, let's move forward. We can always jump backward if we need to.
Okay. So then, beginning at the bottom of page 10 and moving on to page 11, we enter section 3.9540, which are access control standards. And this covers a lot of different things. It starts out by talking about traffic impacts requirements and when that study is required. The section was a little bit difficult to rewrite, but we tried to make some minor modifications to help increase the readability of it. The section also talks about how the different access options, if you are, you know, accessing and you have an alley, or if you have a mid-block intersection, it talks about different types of subdivision lots that can be created. For example, on page 13, you've got double frontage lots, which are when you have a lot that has a front yard and a backyard that fronts on two streets, or even more if it's maybe a corner lot and has a street, and an alley, or a street and a street and a street, so it has 3 street frontages. We talk about reverse frontage lots where if all the houses are lined up on the street facing one way, but your lot actually faces the street behind it. So just the requirements about those things. Frankly, we rarely encounter these types of situations. We don't do a lot of new subdivision plats, and when we do, they tend to follow either curvilinear street layouts, maybe a grid layout, but we don't really encounter these types of situations much. But we have the language in the code. We've pretty much kept it unchanged with just a few minor revisions. So we'll stop and see if there are any questions about that particular section.
Any commissioners have questions on that? Doesn't look like there are any questions. Okay.
So moving on to page 22, section 3.9550. This is where we, as staff, had a lot of comments. We have a lot of concerns about the current language, and we have some thoughts that we want to share with the Planning Commission and get some direction from you and see what your thoughts are. So this section of code, which deals with new development and how you are routing pedestrians and bicycles safely through and around your site and connecting to other sites, was added in 2003 to our code when we adopted the 2003 Transportation System Plan. When we adopt a Transportation System Plan, or a TSP, there are specific requirements in Oregon administrative rules about what needs to be included in those plans and then implemented through a local jurisdiction's codes. And so as part of that, our consultants put together a lot of language that, in my head, is very urban-oriented, and it applies only to our rural communities. So we're talking Arch Cape, Miles Crossing, Jeffers Gardens, Napa Swenson, and Westport. Nowhere else does it apply. But the way that the language is included, and it was updated again in 2015 when we updated our TSP at that time, it requires any new development in a rural community that's commercial or industrial or multifamily to run a bike path through their property, that may not connect to any other part of the system, to install internal walkways. Even if it's a standalone building in Miles Crossing, it would require that all those pedestrian and access improvements. We are in the process right now of applying for a new state grant, and Jay is working on this to update our TSP. And rather than pulling things out of the code right now and risk running afoul of state statute for what might be required, what we have tried to do is make it clearer and a little bit less onerous by shifting around some of the language, not completely removing it. But for example, in subdivisions, it makes sense that you might want to have internal connections and pathways and things like that, but not necessarily for a standalone building where you're going to run a bike path through your parking lot or something like that. So we've tried to make those adjustments here, but what we're proposing is that as part of our TSP update, that we could look at these requirements and craft something that actually fits the unincorporated rural communities and isn't tailored towards a Gerhardt or a Warrenton or a Seaside or something like that. So there's a lot of substantive change, I would say, in this particular section. And I want really to hear what the thoughts of the Planning Commission are on that and get some direction from you.
Any thoughts or comments from commissioners, especially those virtual pair?
I've been a huge bike fan my whole life. I've been a commuter. I've done long distance biking, and I stopped riding my bike when I moved to Clatsop County, and I literally never ride it anymore, living in a rural area, because I just find it so dangerous to be on the road. And I live down Youngs River Road. There's just no way I'm going to ride my bike all the way up Youngs River Road to Miles Crossing, and then riding through Miles Crossing seems like a suicide mission. It's just such an unpleasant experience in every level. And so speaking specifically from Miles Crossing, I mean, I travel through that neighborhood literally multiple times a day. The only people I see on bikes are homeless people and on e-bikes. And I think from a practical standpoint, it might be nice to consider providing a little bit better bike pathway along the major corridors, just to accommodate the e-bikes and the people on motorized skateboards and other weird things that they ride around these days. It just seems really challenging to drive alongside at the speeds that we seem to be driving on through Miles Crossing. As far as this other stuff goes, I love the idea of these interconnected pathways and bikeways. And you're right. It seems more like an urban language to describe sort of the 15-minute vision, right? That seems to be all the rage these days. Everything needs to be within 15 minutes of a bicycle or a pedestrian. That seems impractical from Miles Crossing standpoint. I don't know about the other rural areas in Clatsop County, but I think people mostly have trucks and they drive their trucks. And that just seems to be about it. I just don't even hardly see people walking in those neighborhoods. That's just my practical sort of experience. I don't know if I've addressed or intended to address any of the proposed language, because the details sort of escape me right now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those comments.
No, thanks, Mike. This is Kerry here, and I would agree with you on most of that. I think that you're not going to see a lot of use of these pathways that could be very expensive and possibly cost prohibitive to build. So I think that plan with making some minor modifications right now and then revisiting it later if there's some grant funding available would be appropriate. I think that's probably the best and easiest path forward on this, in my view. So I don't have a lot on it. It's a wordy section. There's a lot going on in here with talking about pathways all over the place, but I don't really feel like it's a good fit for rural Clatsop County. I mean, I can see, like Mike said, I think we need improvements. If you're gonna have these bike paths, they gotta go somewhere, and you in order for that to happen, you need the state and other people to provide pathways on their property, so that you can have some connectivity and you can get around safely. Otherwise, it's kind of moot. Or would we be building just small pathways around neighborhoods that go nowhere?
Well, I think that's good discussion. I have one small question before I add to the comments here. In the first section there, 3.9560, that first paragraph, the way the discussion goes there, it looks as though, or it sounds as though the choice is arbitrary whether the pathway is pedestrian or is a shared use pathway system. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, so the way it is currently worded now, it doesn't spell out when you would have to do a shared pathway for bikes and pedestrians versus just a pedestrian pathway. So we didn't put any standards into or thresholds for when that had to occur. So
I think that would be something that should be added in there to make it clear. Otherwise, and maybe you could comment a little bit about what the actual differences in those types of pathways would be. Is it a width thing, or is it?
Yeah, it's going to be a width thing, and I think we have maybe 8 feet or 10 feet for pedestrian paths, and I forget what the standard is for the shared use path, but it is wider. Shared pathways are 10 feet, pedestrian paths are 6 feet.
So a shared use, would it have a directions, 2 different directions where you're trying to segregate?
Not necessarily.
Uh-huh.
If you think like the Riverwalk, for example, there's no dividing line down the center of that pathway.
Yeah. Well, I think when we get around to really rewriting this with the grant money or whatever the intention is there, that would be worth clarifying some of those things. I do feel that that the citizens or the residents of the county have a right to some kind of access from one area to another. Now, and that would be pedestrian or bicycle or some other means, skateboard, whatever your transportation system is. I don't think it's right to cut people out just because they're not driving a car. Maybe they don't like cars, maybe they can't afford one, maybe their car's out of commission for a while and they're using a bicycle while it's repaired. Whatever the reason is, sure, in a lot of areas, you'd be going 10 miles before you get from point A to point B if those are facilities or services or what have you. But take, for example, leaving Astoria, maybe you want to visit Brem's Nursery out there. I don't know if that's technically in Miles Crossing, but it's near there. You know, the access out to there for somebody walking, which I've done. I've walked from Miles Crossing back into town here, and it's awful. You know, some places you're walking on a slope that's the shoulder of the road, and why don't some of the residents here that don't have four-wheeled vehicles or motorcycles or something like that, why don't they have a decent way of getting around from point A to point B if that's what they want to do? They pay taxes, they're part of the community. So I'd be strongly in favor of encouraging pathways, starting with those areas where there really could be a significant amount of foot traffic or alternative transportation kind of systems that, you know, skateboards or bicycles, whatever, getting from one place to another. And there's a lot of stuff out in Miles Crossing, for example, that isn't right here in Astoria. And some people would prefer to get a little exercise while they go on there. And so I would push for having pathways, not if it became so expensive that people can't run their businesses and all that kind of thing. So it's complicated, but I'm just putting that out as kind of the alternative to not doing them at all, and versus having at least some in busy areas.
Okay. So, if I could, so I think we are talking about two different types of pathways here, no pun intended, but we have sort of the bigger path system, which would be, you know, along your state highways, so that you can come from Astoria over the bridge into Miles Crossing, Jeffers Gardens, and then ride your bike out to Warrenton. So, and then we're talking in here about circulation within a particular site and then connecting out to something, the bigger pathway system. So the way the code is currently worded now, whether I'm a business that has a parking lot that has 3 required parking spaces, or I'm Bella Ridge subdivision, or I'm, you know, an industrial site, I am having to put in access ways and bicycle pathways to connect from parking through the parking lot to my building, and some of that just doesn't seem where I have normally seen it is if you've got a Walmart and you're trying to safely funnel pedestrians from their cars through the parking lot to the building, or provide, you know, connection from a public sidewalk system that's a publicly maintained path or a public sidewalk system into a site so you can route people. The requirements, as I look at them, and I support pathways, I believe that you should have interconnections and we should be able to walk as much as we can or bike as much as we can. But am I really going to bike from Arch Cape up to Miles Crossing? Not unless they put a off-highway path along Highway 101. I'm never going to ride my bike on 101, ever. So I want to make sure that we're clear about the distinction of what our code is covering versus a bigger picture pathway connectivity throughout the county, which I think is more where our discussion is right now. So I just want to be clear about that. And that's also addressed in the TSP, but it's a little bit different from this internal access and connection out to the bigger system.
If I could also add to that, much of what you're talking about are ODOT roads, ODOT highways. And it would probably benefit us to have this TSP discussion with ODOT to see what types of improvements can be made to those highways so that safe movement of people. Right now, the pinch points are the bridges. I mean, both of those bridges, Miles Crossing bridges, are barely wide enough for a truck, let alone a truck, 2 cars, and 5 pedestrians. So it's really going to require ODOT to make some additional decisions on this. But internal property pathways and so forth is where we're focused here, and we're not likely to have the Walmarts and the Fred Meyers and those types of parking facilities constructed even in Miles Crossings and Arch Cape. So, I think Gail is correct. There's 2 different discussions. The one that we're talking about and the ODOT one both can be managed through the TSP discussion.
Mhm. Okay. Well, thanks for that clarification.
There's just a few different strange things that I see in here that, like, on page 24, under section B, if streets with a subdivision or neighborhood are lighted, pathways should also be lighted. Or shall also be lighted. Well, that could mean that you have to provide a lighted pathway all, you know, behind everything, or where, even if you have street lights, and if you have a pathway somewhere else, that you'd have to have the entire pathway lit. Whereas we have parts of the Estuary Riverwalk that aren't even lit. We have streets that are lit up and everything else, but pathway itself, which is a pedestrian pathway, is not lit. So it's kind of it's a big ask maybe in some ways, if you're requiring pathways and then you require them to be lit if you have street lights, or else it could be a deterrent for having a street light. Maybe you're not gonna light the streets because you'd have to light everything if you lit the streets. So there's just some considerations there that need to be looked at. I don't really feel like you should have to, if it's not right next to the street, that maybe you don't need to light that up. If it is next to the street, well, maybe you should. But also, I'm thinking of the Bella Ridge subdivision that's fairly recent in Miles Crossing. I don't believe that has streetlights.
I don't know if it has streetlights or not, and it was approved before I got here, but I know that they had required a connection between the subdivision and the school, and the school actually did not want the connection.
Oh, they didn't want it on their end?
No. So we ended up waiving that requirement because the school didn't want it.
Because it's a public pathway right into the school property.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact reason why, but yeah, they didn't want it.
Right.
But that's a situation where this type of requirement would have made sense, because you potentially could have lots of school-age kids, and why put them on a bus or send them down the road when they could just internally connect to the property next door?
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts on this section? Anybody?
I'd just like to make a closing, just a comment, to address, Ms. Hendrickson's comments and others as well. And when I worked in Phoenix in the land development juggernaut for a dozen years, a lot of these types of planning decisions were baked in to every new subdivision because they were breaking new ground and they were building new water treatment facilities and new schools and, you know, multiple neighborhoods with different price points and you know, paths along washes and pedestrian bridges, and the whole thing was just master planned, and it makes complete sense to bake that into all of this. And I think to get to Commissioner Johnson's comments about added cost resulting from, you know, additional lighting and all that other stuff, it only really makes sense if there's a master plan, and I don't know if the county is even involved in that kind of thing, to sort of say, look, this is the goal. We're gonna move people as development occurs, and over time there's going to become these connectivity arterials, and then you can sort of sell that from a marketing standpoint if you're someone like a builder, right? And then you can sort of defray the cost of all the additional infrastructure by baking into, you know, it becomes a right or an option that you can, instead of taking the bus, you can walk. And maybe that sounds appealing to some people, and maybe they're willing to pay extra for that. I mean, they certainly do. I just don't know how, you know, looking at Miles Crossing, for example, I don't know anything about Arch K, but Miles Crossing, I just don't even see how you would even begin to deal with connectors unless you were going to ask citizens with land to devote some of their land to easements and then construct these paths with lights and things like that. Is that what the county is trying to do with this language? Is sort of work on some master plan for arterials for pedestrians and bikes?
So that's the big picture part of bike paths and connectivity discussion. The rules that are in the code right now, Mike, are really looking more towards how are we routing people within developments and then, I guess, getting them out to the main road. So it doesn't necessarily deal with the main road connectivity. And as Jay pointed out, a lot of those roads are going to be ODOT roads. So Highway 101 business is going to be ODOT. Highway 101 is going to be ODOT. You know, we just don't have the control over that. That larger master connectivity does get discussed in the TSP, in the Transportation System Plan. What we're trying to do is develop, in this particular section of code, is I'm trying to think of a good example, and I'm going to use Arch Cape Deli because they are recently approved. But so they have off of right on 101, the old post office. They're trying to convert it into a deli. The way that this wording is currently, it would require crosswalks and striped crosswalks within the parking lot to connect people from their parking space to the building. It would require safe bicycle access into and through the parking lot to be able to get to the building, with designated areas and shared pathways to route those people into a site. And so when you're talking about a site that's probably less than an acre, in a parking lot that is not very large, I forget how many parking spaces they had, it seems to be a little bit excessive. It seems to me that the standards are set up more for much larger developments, or if you had some sort of, you know, industrial park campus where you were, you know, had street layouts and multiple businesses and, you know, possibly light truck traffic coming through, where you'd want to have those separations. But if I'm on Beeline and I'm going to build a new 4,000 square foot building, we have to look and make sure that there's some sort of proportionality between what's being required and what's being constructed and what the impact is. How many pedestrians and bicyclists, maybe some of the employees might want to ride their bikes or walk there, but is it necessary to have striped crosswalks and designated bike paths through that parking lot to route 3 employees who may or may not ride a bike ever to work? So I think that's what we're trying to reach with this code language, is something that is in proportion to what the actual scale of development is that's likely to occur. Does that make sense? Maybe not.
Yeah. You want to respond to that, Mike, or Commissioner Magyar? Guess not.
No, I'm sorry. I thought I was unmuted. No, that makes complete sense. Thank you, Ms. Hendrickson, for clarifying all of that.
And so, following up on that, the idea, you could pretty easily establish some sizes of parking lots and things where it would be seemingly appropriate to have designated pathways, and others that are so small it seems kind of silly. So is that the plan, to say, you know, if the parking lot's, I don't know what a big parking lot is, so to say 5,000 square feet or something, at that point, maybe you require that there be a designated pathway across it from wherever the arterial is, or the street that fronts the property. And then, you know, for smaller lots, you just don't need that. Isn't that a pretty reasonable way to do it? Or?
Well, I guess the direction I'm asking from the Planning Commission is, do you want staff to develop that language now as part of this process, or can we work with the changes that we are proposing right now and wait until we may get the grant money to update the TSP and do it as part of that?
Well, my vote would be to wait and do it with the revised TSP rather than piecemeal it now. But
I'd rather make these small changes now and then have the TSP look into it further. If we're saying
that's essentially what I'm saying too. Do the other two commissioners have an opinion on that they'd like to share?
Sure, it's Commissioner Linder. I think I'm in agreement with what you two are proposing, where we kind of go with what we've got now, don't make any wholesale changes until the TSP is updated, which I think is a good idea. Separate from that, what's the timeline for that to happen?
The grant application, this is, Planning Manager Jay Blake. The grant application is due in July, and we anticipate that we will start the TSP process in 2025. And, I don't know exactly how long it will take, but, in this interim timeframe, we do have at least some changes that help to clarify this. And then the bigger picture about, establishing those thresholds, that can be done through a much bigger public process, I think.
Okay, so just so I'm understanding, whatever changes that if we're just going to make these minimal changes here and then wait for the TSP, then we have to, in our minds, be okay that this is going to be what the rules are for probably at least 2 years, because that's probably how long realistically it's going to take for the TSP to get completed, or could it be longer than that?
I think that's a reasonable expectation. 2 years.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it sounds like we have pretty much a consensus here of how to proceed on this.
Is the TSP review, is that something that you would anticipate the planning commission to be a part of that, or is that gonna happen?
Mhm.
Yep, that is a joint public works and planning project where we look at our code, we look at design standards for local roads, and we look at the changing traffic patterns. For instance, with the all the construction in Warrenton off of Dolphin and Warrior Way, there's new needs for us to look at those intersections along 101. The new high school in Seaside is changing traffic patterns. So all of those changes that have happened in the last 10 years are really making it necessary to look at our standards in relationship to future development, and also help Public Works prioritize the local projects that they want to put into the capital improvements program. So it's a joint planning Public Works exercise.
Okay.
And it is required because of goal 12, I think it's goal 12, the transportation goal. And so we are required to have a transportation system plan. And the last time we updated ours was 2015. So it'll be about 10 years, and it's overdue.
How have we been doing on meeting the goals of the last plan?
That's a good question.
I think we've been pretty good at ticking off construction projects through Public Works, and I know that there were changes to the development code that made us compliant with the new state regulations, state goal requirements. In terms of promoting new highways and so forth, Ensign Lane was probably the biggest thing that's been done in the last 10, 15 years. And again, even that has changed in 10 years with the sheriff's department and the jail improvements and all the things that have happened out there. So it's time for us to look at those things again.
Yeah, and I think with the Fort Point development, there were some things in the transportation system plan. And the way our plan is set up right now, there are long-term aspirational projects that are in there, and that's a majority of our projects because of the cost, the land acquisition, just the geography of some places make some of those prove. And then there are some of the more realistic things, which, as Jay pointed out, I think we have checked off. A lot of them are tied into cities, and especially that Warrenton area.
Which there are many county roads, even within cities, so that has to be factored into the TSP. Like, I believe that that is a county road that runs out there by Fort Stevens.
Correct. That's Ridge Road. It is a county road.
Ridge Road is a county road.
Yep.
Will access a fairly large proposed subdivision out there, so.
Yeah, so there will be opportunities for the planning commission to be involved during the, work to be done to put the plan together and make changes to it. And then the plan does come back by ordinance, so it will come to you for a recommendation to the board, and then the board will have 2 public hearings on it. All right, so if we are done talking about pathways, I appreciate the input and the discussion, and I think we have a couple of things that we'll bring back to you at a later meeting regarding the railroad track clarification and thresholds for shared versus pedestrian paths. All right, so from there, we move on to page 29. And section 3.9600, subdivision design standards. And again, this section was gone through very thoroughly in 2021, so we have only made minimal changes here. On page 36, we are proposing to remove some language. Let's see here. That talks, I think, creates some conflicts within our code. So on 36, we're taking out some language that specifies required lot width and depth for interior lots, and that conflicts with what language may be included in the actual zone requirements. So we've taken that language out, just so that there's no confusion about how that should be implemented. So that was a fairly significant change. A lot of it is just clean up and to correct spelling errors or eliminate redundant language. On page 38, we tried to clarify this large lot subdivision language, just because it seemed very messy and unclear. So you'll see some significant rewriting there. And that really is that. And then section 3.9800 on page 42, these are the road standards, which Public Works just redid in 2021, so we did not propose any changes to that section. And that was everything for this work session. Next month, we'll be wrapping up Article 3. We have our farm forest standards that we're going to go through. And then we will begin Article 4 next month as well, which are our zone requirements, our zoning districts and the zoning requirements. So at that point, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is the county sanitarian an official title of somebody?
It is. I learned that when I first started here. It is the person who approves septic tanks.
Okay.
Systems.
Isn't that a DEQ position? Or is it both?
It may be at DEQ state level, but here in the county, when you go over and you work with Lucas and Annette, I think Lucas would now be classified as the county sanitarian.
Okay, all right.
It's an antiquated term, but it's still officially in effect.
Okay. On the water supply, it's on page 41. Lots with a subdivision shall either be served by a public domestic water supply system conforming to state or county specifications, or the lot size shall be increased to provide such separation of water sources and sewage disposal facilities. Is there any, I know that there have been some homes that have been capturing rainwater. Mm-hmm. Is that included somewhere else or permitted somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. It's in, I believe, Article 2, maybe it's Article 3, and we have a section that talks about the requirement to have 250 gallons per day of potable water, and then there are about 5 different sources, so it can be community water system, a well, spring water, and rain catchment system is one of those.
Would it be a good idea to reference that section from here in the proposed language for a subdivision?
We can certainly do that.
Because if you read this, it says, well, you got to have public domestic water supply system, but there are alternatives to that.
So the way it reads now, is either gonna be served by a public domestic water system or
The lot size will increase.
or the lot size has to increase. But I guess if you did rain catchment,
There's also wells.
right, but if you have a well, there is that separation
Separation.
requirement
Yeah.
between your septic and your well. I don't know that if you used a rainwater system, you'd have to increase your lot size necessarily, but, all right, we will figure out a way to work that in.
And with rainwater, are there, I'm not that familiar with them, there are specific systems that the state has approved, or is it just a volume that you need to meet, demonstrate that you can have enough water from?
So the rainwater catchment system actually gets approved through building codes. Then, I don't know what the requirements are from building codes in terms of how a system is designed, except, they need to meet the minimum 250 gallons per day requirement, so.
Any, other comments from, the commissioners on the virtual end of things?
No comment.
I have one more.
Go for
This
it.
is, on page 38, where it talks about that if the county has an interest in acquiring any portion of the proposed subdivision for a public purpose. That seems like kind of an odd thing. It's where you're gonna set aside for 1 year, a period not to exceed 1 year.
Mhm.
That's probably just language that's been in there forever and
Also, it ensures that the county or a public entity like a school can't just lay claim to a land indefinitely,
yeah.
so,
It does set a time frame, so there's one year.
yeah.
I don't know, just odd to me. Maybe that's how you have to handle it.
I have one little nitpicky question on page, 31, talking about alignment, item number 5 there. And it talks about these offset street intersections, staggered street alignment, it's called. And, you read down there, kind of the second half of the paragraph, and it talks about, staggered street alignment resulting in T intersections shall leave a minimum distance of 200 feet between the center lines of the street, having approximately the same direction, and shall not be less than 125 feet. So, as I read that, it sounds like in one case you're saying it's a minimum distance of 200 feet, and then a little later you say it's 125. What's the difference there that I'm not seeing?
The difference is that when I took out the unclear and non-objective language wherever practical, and otherwise, we shifted the meaning, so, that's,
Okay.
Clear as mud, isn't it?
well, it made sense when the sentence read, wherever practical, leave 200 feet, but otherwise, your minimum is 125, but when you take out wherever practical,
Yeah.
you establish that minimum of 200 feet and then contradict it immediately afterwards, so.
That's chaos.
Yep.
That is chaos.
All right. Any final words of wisdom or comments or suggestions from any of the commissioners on this part of our task for chaos? Seeing none, I think we've finished item number 2 of the agenda, and we're ready for a project status report.
Yeah, you'll see that, the project status report is shrinking as we are getting things approved and getting acknowledgement from DLCD. So, Southwest Coastal Plan has been acknowledged, that will be coming off next month. Arch Cape Deli, Jay, do you want to give an update about that one?
I met with the owner, and we then, a month later, met with the owner's architect. And that was a month ago, and the owner went on vacation. And so we've not had any action, but David, senior planner, David Cook, and I went through all of the requirements for the resubmittal of the plans. It's a fairly significant change to what was previously approved. It's going to be less of a redevelopment project than originally thought because of escalating costs. But at this point in time, we're just waiting for an application to come through.
Thank you. And other than that, at the bottom of page 45, the geologic hazard report preparation was approved by the board last week. That's been sent over to DLCD for their final acknowledgement, so that should become effective on June 7th. And that's all I have for that.
All right. Looks like things are moving along. So final item on the agenda is the director's report.
A lot of it's self-explanatory, but Child Care Barriers Work Group, we have another meeting at the end of the month. We had 217 responses to the child care survey, which was very good. So if you forwarded that out, thank you. Comprehensive plan update. Do you have anything you want to say about the economic opportunities analysis?
Yes, the economic opportunities analysis is moving forward. We expect to have a meeting next week. We have severed our working relationship with the current consulting staff. We were not getting adequate response from them, and we're going to bring the remaining portions of the EOA in-house, and I'll be working on that. It'll become a very large portion of my job. The EOA is going to be less focused on developable land for commercial industrial development and more about policies and procedures moving forward that the county should be doing to diversify its work force and its jobs availability. So as we have changes from the HCP coming through, that's going to change one of the most significant employing groups in our area. The changes to tourism, the changes to fishing, and the changes to forestry all are having kind of a penultimate impact on the future of employment in our area. So we're looking at that with a much more critical eye, trying to figure out what the county's role is and what we really should be working on to make this a better place to work.
Well, that's quite informative and sounds exceedingly important to take on. I do think, though, that identifying the industrial and commercial lands is still a part of that.
Yeah, it is.
And do you think that at this point in time we have a need for a substantial update of what we know about that?
Commissioner Ferrara, it's a very good question. The consulting group put together some initial findings, and I found a number of errors with it. So I worked with our internal GIS staff, and we looked at all zoning, all developable, all vacant land, and there's a total across the county, again, remember, outside the cities, of 19 acres of commercial industrial land that isn't already developed. Our next step is to look at which sites are underdeveloped, which have development potential. And so I have a meeting this week with them to go over how we're going to discern that number. But land, in terms of commercial and industrial land, that's not one of our greatest assets, because forestry and agriculture, those resource lands are very sacred. And so we are not going to have an opportunity to say, hey, we'd like to create an 80-acre industrial park out there. We don't have that option in the rural setting. So we have to figure out what the county's role is to support economic development that's happening in Astoria, in Warrenton, in Gerhardt, Seaside, and Cannon Beach, because we're not going to see major construction of industrial commercial employment opportunities in the rural sections because we don't have infrastructure to support it. We don't have sewer and water, which a lot of industrial uses need much more of that than we can provide.
Okay, sounds like quite a challenge.
Okay. Goals 16 through 18, we had our public meeting on April 20th. We've got a website up for the project, and so any future announcements will come from that. We're working on setting up the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee, but I do not believe that we have a date for that yet. Housing Task Force, do you have anything to report?
The state of Oregon has funded a buildable lands inventory for the entire county, including rural county and all of the cities. So we're doing a combined project. It's very unique. Well, we will be looking at all buildable lands within all jurisdictions. We have representatives from all the cities involved, and so that's a fairly large undertaking. Alyssa Gertler, the housing manager for the county, is the lead, and I'm the planning coordinator, liaison, if you will. But we meet monthly, and we're working on gathering all the data. And the idea is to create a very accurate listing of land that actually could be developed for housing.
Okay.
Is that task force taking into account the difficulty and cost of developing some of that land and all
Yes.
the other wetland factors and geological factors?
An example, and I'll go back to my Warrenton time, the 2019 housing study said that Warrenton had the ability to build like 5,000 housing units because we've got so much land out there. But it really didn't take into consideration the fact that a majority of that land was either floodplain or wetlands or in the tsunami zone. So there was a lot of question as to whether or not it truly was developable. So that's part of this goal, is to actually look at those lands.
Is there a way to put that in a percentage, you know, like, okay, you can build 5,000 homes in Warrenton, but 100% of those are in the tsunami zone.
That's what we're looking
Or
at, yes.
75% of those are in a wetland. Then you can add those layers on top of it, and some of them are in multiple different issues with why they're not practically developable, even though on paper they still have the density.
We just did that with this economic lands, or employment lands, where we took a parcel of land and there were multiple layers. One, is it in the flood zone? Number two, is it in the tsunami zone? Number three, does it have wetlands? Number four, are there access issues? I mean, so we essentially were able to pare it down to just a few parcels, and so we're hoping to do that on a countywide basis.
Okay.
In the same way.
I think that would be the first step, is our knowledge of what practically is our buildable lands inventory. It's lacking right now. So we don't know. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Anything else on the task force?
No.
Okay. Army Corps, we are still continuing our weekly meetings. We still have not received an application yet from the Army Corps, but supposedly it's in the works. And if you saw the Daily Historian headlines this morning, the Coast Guard is looking to formalize and federalize their anchorage out by Rice Island. So I anticipate that may also become part of this discussion that we're having with the Army Corps, because there may be some changes to the code that might be required for that. And then finally, if you are here in person today, you got to meet Rebecca Sprengler, who is our new permit tech. And for those of you who are online, Roan's last day was Tuesday last week, and we are happy to have Rebecca here. Rebecca, did you have anything you would like to say to the Planning Commission?
No, I'm very thankful to be here, very happy to meet you all in person. Hopefully I'll get to meet the rest of you that are on Zoom in the future, and please let me know if there's anything I can do to move the meeting over or prepare for it. I'm excited to work with you.
Yep. So we're very happy to have Rebecca with us.
I like the notebook format. I used to do that myself, get the packet and triple hole punch all my pages and put them in my own binders.
Good job. All right, and then we did hire Matt Moore, who was a building inspector. We hired him to be our new building official, and he is here, and we are working, I think we have a serious candidate for electrical inspector, which is great. That position's been open for about 9 months. And so we then will need to backfill Matt's position and hire another building inspector. But it looks like personnel-wise, we're starting to get back to where we were and get settled back in. So that is good news for everybody. And that's my report. Thank you.
Very good report, and shows there's a heck of a lot of work yet to be done, which I guess is good in a way, but hopefully we'll get through it in a productive way. Any good of the order from any of the commissioners? Don't hear any. So just go out and enjoy a nice sunny day in Astoria. That's my good of the order. And I will close the meeting at about 11:11 or maybe 11:10 Pacific Daylight Time. Thank you all for your attention.